The weight of salt, markets, preservation, and power. The necessity of salt. If you think of history's most influential commodities, perhaps gold or silver comes to mind, or spices carried across continents. Yet one of the most unassuming and ordinary substances, salt, shaped societies in ways far greater than its dull, white crystals suggest. To live without salt was unthinkable. It was preservation, flavor, medicine, and even currency. In many ways, the story of salt is the story of survival. The nature of salt. Salt, sodium chloride, is found in abundance in oceans and in certain inland deposits. Yet in the pre-modern world, acquiring it in usable form was neither simple nor guaranteed. Coastal communities harvested it by evaporating seawater, a process dependent on climate and labor. Inland, salt had to be mined, carried, and traded over great distances. Unlike grains or timber, it could not be grown. Its scarcity, combined with its necessity, made it precious. Salt is not glamorous, but it is indispensable. Humans require it physiologically to balance hydration and nerve function. Animals, too, depend on it, which is why salt licks draw herds and why pastoralists sought it. More critically, before refrigeration, salt was the essential preservative. It kept fish from spoiling, cured meat through winter, and enabled armies and cities alike to store provisions. Salt in the kitchen. For the common household, salt was a daily necessity. In kitchens, it seasoned otherwise bland stews and breads. More importantly, it preserved food for the lean months. Meat was salted in barrels, rubbed until the crystals drew out moisture, and stored in cool cellars. Fish, especially herring and cod, were heavily salted, then dried or packed in brine, ensuring supplies long after the catch. The taste of preserved food was distinct, often harsh. Salted fish had to be soaked in water before cooking, and salted meat was tough. Yet for those without access to fresh supplies, it was life itself. To eat without salt was to face hunger when fields lay barren and waters froze. Salt as medicine and ritual. Salt also played roles beyond the kitchen. Physicians prescribed it for ailments, mixing it into concoctions for digestion or sore throats. Midwives sometimes used it in rituals of birth. In churches, salt was blessed and used in baptisms, symbolizing purity and incorruptibility. Its presence in sacred rites gave it a power beyond its chemistry. Thus, salt occupied a strange position, humble and everyday, yet charged with symbolism. It was scattered across tables casually, but also placed with solemnity on altars. The salt trade. Because salt was not evenly available, it created networks of trade. Coastal regions with salt pans shipped crystals inland, while mining towns exported blocks along caravan routes. The famous Via Salaria in Rome, the Salt Road, connected coastal supplies to the interior. In medieval Europe, salt from the Atlantic coasts of France and Portugal traveled north, while mines in places like Salzburg, Austria, supplied central regions. Caravans in Africa carried salt across the Sahara, trading it for gold in Timbuktu. In China, Salt taxes sustained dynasties for centuries, fueling state power. Wherever salt moved, wealth and authority followed. Markets grew at its intersections. Cities flourished on its trade. Salt and power. Rulers quickly recognized salt's value as a source of revenue. By taxing it, they could draw steady income. In France, the gabelle, a tax on salt, became infamous, resented by peasants for centuries. It was one of the sparks of discontent leading to revolution. In China, the salt monopoly was a pillar of government finance, funding armies and bureaucracy. Salt was heavy, bulky, and awkward to transport, yet its taxation gave rulers control. Unlike luxury goods, everyone needed salt. No household could escape it. No villager could ignore it. Thus, salt became not just a commodity, but a lever of governance. Salt workers. Behind this great story of trade and taxation were the workers. In coastal salt pans, men and women labored to evaporate seawater, raking crystals from flats under the sun. In mines, workers chipped blocks from deep shafts, hauling them to the surface in baskets. The work was grueling, often dangerous. Inhaling salt dust scarred lungs and brine corroded skin. Yet their labor supplied empires and fed families. For many, this was monotonous toil. Raking, lifting, drying, storing. Yet monotony built markets, and markets built states. Salt and daily life. For the average household, salt was bought in small quantities, carefully conserved. It might be sold in cloth-wrapped lumps, scraped off as needed. Some families stretched supplies by mixing salt with ashes or other powders, though this weakened its preserving power. To run out of salt was a minor crisis, demanding urgent purchase. Tables often displayed salt in small bowls or cellars, a mark of hospitality. In noble households, the placement of the salt cellar on the dining table marked social rank. To sit above the salt was to be among the honored guests, while below the salt indicated lesser status. Even here, the dull crystals carried meaning. The global reach of salt. Salt connected the world in quiet ways. From English fisheries exporting salted herring, to Venetian merchants controlling salt routes in the Mediterranean, to caravans trekking across deserts with slabs of rock salt strapped to camels. It was everywhere. Yet it was rarely celebrated. Few poems praised salt, few monuments commemorate it. Its influence was silent, steady, unremarkable yet immense. Reflection. Salt, then, was not only a mineral but a measure of survival and power. It seasoned daily bread, preserved armies' rations, supported empires through taxation, and connected continents through trade. Without it, preservation faltered, meals spoiled, and states weakened. And so you might wonder, if salt was so central to the machinery of survival and governance, what happened when societies began to over-rely on it? Could the very substance that preserved life also bring about conflict, inequality, and resistance? Salt routes, taxes, and the burdens of empire. When you left the story of salt in Section 1, you had seen how it was more than a seasoning. It was survival, preservation, ritual, and governance. But salt did not merely sit in barrels and kitchens. It moved across mountains, deserts, and seas. It was carried by donkeys, camels, barges, and ships. Wherever it traveled, rulers sought to tax it, merchants sought to profit from it, and common people bore its cost. Salt routes, quiet and uneventful compared to tales of conquest, formed the hidden arteries of empires. The long roads of salt. The Roman Via Salaria, the Salt Road, is perhaps the most famous. Stretching from the Adriatic coast inland, it supplied Rome itself with the essential mineral. Legions marched along it, traders hauled carts across it, peasants trudged with baskets balanced on shoulders. Long after the Republic gave way to empire, the route endured, for salt could not be dispensed with. In medieval Europe, similar routes threaded across landscapes. Caravans carried blocks of mined salt from Salzburg, its very name meaning salt fortress, down the Danube into Central Europe. In France, roads led from the salt marshes of Brittany into the interior. Venice became rich not only from spices, but also from controlling salt in the Mediterranean. In Africa, camel caravans bore slabs of salt across the Sahara. Each slab could weigh 60 to 80 kilograms, cut into neat rectangles from desert deposits. These were strapped onto camels, sometimes in long trains of hundreds of animals. They moved from Tadeni into Gaza to cities like Timbuktu, where salt was exchanged for gold, ivory, and slaves. Without these caravans, inland Africa might have gone without one of life's necessities: salt and taxation. Because salt was universal, it was an easy target for rulers. Unlike luxury goods, which only the wealthy consumed, everyone needed salt. Peasant or noble, farmer or merchant. Taxing it ensured steady income. In China, the salt monopoly funded dynasties for centuries. As early as the Tang and Song periods, the government controlled production and trade. Merchants could only sell salt with licenses, and taxes on it filled state coffers. Entire bureaucracies existed solely to oversee the salt trade, ensuring its revenue reached the throne. In France, the gabelle became one of the most hated taxes of the Ancien regime. Instituted in the 14th century, it required households to purchase a minimum amount of salt at fixed prices. Enforcement was strict. Smuggling was common, but punishments were harsh. For the peasantry, the gabelle symbolized oppression. It was not abstract. It reached into every kitchen. The English crown too saw the value of salt taxes, though they were not as famously resented as the French version. Still, wherever salt could be controlled, it provided a reliable source of revenue. Smuggling and resistance. Wherever taxes grew heavy, smuggling followed. In France, faussonneurs, illegal salt smugglers, risked their lives to avoid the gabelle. They carried contraband salt through forests, rivers, and hidden paths. Communities often turned a blind eye, for everyone suffered under the tax. Punishments were severe. Smugglers might be branded, imprisoned, or even executed. Yet the trade persisted, for salt was too essential to abandon. In some regions, smuggling became a way of life, a silent resistance to state power. Even in China, despite the enormous bureaucracy of the salt monopoly, illicit trade flourished. Black market salt sellers provided cheaper supplies to villages, evading official channels. The state could never fully eliminate them. Thus, the story of salt was also the story of quiet defiance. Ordinary people, seeking only to preserve their food and feed their families, found themselves in conflict with empires. The burden of transport. Moving salt was a logistical challenge. It was heavy, bulky, and not especially valuable per unit weight compared to gold or spices. Caravans needed hundreds of animals to make the trade profitable. Ships groaned under the weight of barrels. Still, rulers and merchants invested in its transport because demand never waned. Armies on campaign required salted provisions. Cities without local deposits depended entirely on trade. The cost of transport and taxes inflated prices, making salt disproportionately expensive in some regions. For the poorest, this meant constant worry about whether they could afford enough to survive the winter. The burden fell hardest on those least able to bear it. A nobleman could pay inflated prices without noticing. A peasant, by contrast, might spend a significant portion of his earnings on salt. In this sense, salt routes were both lifelines and chains. Salt markets. Markets dedicated to salt existed in towns across Europe, Asia, and Africa. They were rarely glamorous. Stalls piled with barrels or sacks, scales to measure lumps, clerks recording taxes. The air was dusty, tinged with brine. Yet these markets were central to community life. They were places where peasants mingled with merchants, where news was exchanged alongside salt, where rulers' authority was made visible in tax collectors and officials. In some cities, the salt market was the largest and busiest, a reminder of the mineral's importance. Venice's Rialto markets, for example, bustled with salt as much as with spices. Control of Adriatic salt pans allowed the city to dominate trade, using its naval power to protect shipments. The wealth of Venice, so often attributed to silk and pepper, owed just as much to humble crystals. Salt as a tool of control. By controlling salt, rulers controlled populations. When states monopolized production or taxed trade, they could enforce loyalty and obedience. To withhold salt was to threaten survival. In China, rebels sometimes attacked salt depots, knowing this would cripple state finances. In France, resentment over the gabelle was not just about money, but about dignity. The tax invaded households in the most basic way. It dictated what people ate, how they preserved food, even where they could buy supplies. Salt was thus not only economic, but political. To govern salt was to govern life. Empires of salt. Some regions built entire identities on salt. Salzburg in Austria grew wealthy on its mines, its bishops styling themselves princes. Towns across Germany, like Lüneburg, rose on the profits of their brine springs. In Africa, desert outposts such as Tagaza and Tadini existed solely for salt extraction, their populations enduring harsh conditions because trade was so lucrative. Empires stretched across these routes. They taxed caravans, protected traders, and sometimes fought wars over deposits. The wealth generated by salt was rarely celebrated, but it underpinned power. Reflection. The story of salt in this section is less about its taste or its preservation, and more about its movement and its burden. It moved along dusty roads, across deserts, through mountain passes, and over seas. It was weighed and taxed, smuggled and fought over. And so you might ask yourself, if salt routes bound empires together, what happened when those same empires faltered? Did the burden of salt taxation help undermine them, fueling discontent that no ruler, however powerful, could suppress? Salt and the seeds of change. So far, you have seen how salt was survival itself, how it traveled across roads and deserts, how it filled treasuries and burdened peasants. But the story of salt does not end with barrels of fish or caravans of camels. Its quiet presence in daily life eventually shaped revolutions, rebellions, and transformations that changed entire societies. The same substance that preserved meat could also ferment unrest, salt, and social tension. Because salt touched every household, it carried unusual weight in times of hardship. A poor harvest meant less grain, but at least some might survive the year. Salt, however, could not be grown or replaced. When its price rose due to taxation or shortages, anger was inevitable. In France, the hated gabelle became a symbol of royal tyranny. Peasants grumbled as they were forced to buy government-controlled salt at inflated prices. They watched smugglers punished harshly for offering cheaper supplies. For many, the gabelle was not abstract fiscal policy, but a daily insult, a reminder that the crown controlled even the most basic of necessities. It is no surprise that during the French Revolution, one of the first demands of the people was the abolition of this tax. In China, salt monopolies fueled corruption. Officials skimmed profits, merchants bribed inspectors, and peasants paid the price. At times, smuggling became so widespread that the state lost much of its revenue. Yet still, ordinary people bore the burden. Salt, in this way, revealed the fractures within empires, the distance between ruler and subject, the imbalance between necessity and exploitation. Gandhi's Salt March, perhaps the most famous modern episode in the history of salt, occurred not in Europe or China, but in India in 1930. Under British colonial rule, Indians were forbidden from collecting their own salt. Instead, they had to purchase it through colonial monopolies and taxes. To resist this, Mohandas Gandhi organized the Salt March. He and his followers walked over 200 miles to the sea, where he symbolically picked up a lump of salt, defying British law. The act was simple, even dull: no battle, no grand declaration. Yet it carried enormous power. By choosing salt, Gandhi highlighted the absurdity of colonial control over something so basic. Millions of Indians could understand this protest, for they too relied on salt daily. The Salt March demonstrated how something boring and ordinary could become a weapon of political change. Its impact was global, inspiring movements of nonviolent resistance elsewhere. Salt and technological change. Beyond politics, Salt was also reshaped by technology. With the invention of refrigeration in the 19th and 20th centuries, its role as a preservative diminished. Meat and fish could now be kept fresh without heavy salting. Salt remained essential for flavor, but its power over survival weakened. This shift altered economies. Regions once dependent on salt trade lost their dominance. Caravans no longer crossed deserts bearing slabs, and fishing fleets reduced their reliance on salted exports. The world of salt shrank, becoming less visible, less central. Yet its historical legacy remained. The centuries of taxes, the routes carved into landscapes, the empires built upon its crystals. Salt and culture. Even as its economic role faded, salt retained cultural and symbolic importance. To eat salt with someone was, in many societies, a sign of loyalty or hospitality. In Russia, bread and salt were offered to guests as a welcome. In Japan, salt was used to purify spaces and rituals. In countless kitchens, a pinch of salt before a meal remained customary. Thus, salt never disappeared from human consciousness. It shifted from empire builder to cultural symbol, from survival necessity to seasoning and tradition. A commodity that shaped revolutions. If you step back, you can see how salt's story mirrors that of many boring substances. It was never glamorous like silk, never rare like gold, never intoxicating like spices. Yet it shaped revolutions, filled treasuries, and linked continents. The French Revolution, the decline of Chinese dynasties, the Indian independence movement, all carried salt within their narratives. It was there, quietly provoking discontent, fueling smuggling, symbolizing control. Without salt, these events might not have unfolded in the same way. Reflection. The story of salt is not about brilliance or glory, but about endurance and necessity. It was crystals scraped from pans, slabs hauled across deserts, barrels filled with brine. It was the sweat of workers, the burdens of peasants, the greed of rulers. Its influence lay in its constancy, the fact that no one could live without it. And so you might wonder, if something as ordinary as salt could shape empires and revolutions, what other boring substances surround us today, quietly underpinning our world? Could it be oil, lithium, grain, or even water? What stories might future historians tell of our age, when they sift through the ordinary to find the extraordinary hidden within?